what's driving up the LDL then? What's the mechanism here? And of course, what are the implications for risk? People who are leaner tend to have the increases in LDL. So if you go do the randomized controlled trials in lean people, so normal BMI under 25, there is an increase in LDL. You look at RCTs on people with overweight or obesity class 1, no increase. Obesity class 2, you actually see a decrease.
Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chaffee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining another episode of the Plant-Free MD. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Chaffee, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Nick Norwitz, who is who's kind enough to join us in the middle of his studies over at Harvard Medical School. Nick, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So for people that don't know who you are, haven't come across your work before, can you tell us a bit about you?
Sure. I'm a relatively new face to the space. I am born and bred in New England. I grew up in Boston and Connecticut for a while. I went to Dartmouth College where I studied cell bio and biochem. And as I was finishing up my undergrad studies, started to develop some issues with inflammatory bowel disease, specifically ulcerative colitis. After college, I went across the pond to Oxford to do my Ph.D. in human metabolism. And around that time, I was having some more health troubles as well with the IBD. Ended up getting quite sick. And long story short, like a lot of people out of desperation, tried a ketogenic diet and actually found it was incredibly effective for my IBD. The only thing that really worked well, my symptoms went away and my inflammatory markers went down. And even years later on biopsy testing, there's no sign of disease. So that was my, let's say, bait into the metabolic health, low carb space. And ever since then, I've been delving into the communities and the research and just really been taken in a new direction with respect to my, let's say, career trajectory and purpose. I finished up my PhD and then came back across the pond to do medical school at Harvard. So I'm now in my third year, so 1 year from completing the whole MD PhD quest and saga. It's a long span of time. And over the past couple of years, I've just been really engaged in the research. It's kind of a pretty special place and time. And I feel very privileged to have access through social media to so many cool and interesting people to be able to come on podcasts and talk about the work I'm doing while also being able to access the resources that are provided by the academic institutions that I'm at. So it's a pretty cool networking opportunity. And I'm really exciting to be starting my career and have all this fun data to delve into, specifically with respect to a phenotype that we've been studying for a while. And I guess that's going to be the topic of our discussion, which is lean mass hyperresponders, people who see these massive increases in cholesterol when they go low carb, like myself. So yeah, that's where we are, and that's who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you get involved with the lean mass hyperresponder sort of research?
Yeah. So for those who don't know the story, it was the concept and the term was coined by Dave Feldman, who's a software engineer. In 2015, he went keto, noticed his LDL skyrocketed, and over a period of years, he was noticing, the people that are seeing these increases in the LDL, quote, bad cholesterol, actually tend to be the ones who are lean and pretty healthy. That's kind of weird. So we came up with this phenotype, which he termed lean mass hyperresponders, which actually, by definition, has no criteria for leanness. It's a triad of markers. So high LDL above 200, high HDL above 80, and low triglycerides below 70. Now, people ask why these cut points. Well, each one is pretty rare alone. To have them coincide, it would be very unlikely by chance, making us think it's kind of part of a pattern. So it's kind of like if you roll a dice, 100-sided dice, 3 times, what's the chance you're going to get the same number on every roll? Very, very low in the general population. So when they do occur, we think it, probably part of a pattern. So he first observed this, put together those criteria, and over the span of years had been acquiring, let's just say, some generals to his army. And in 2019, which is when I went keto, I observed the same thing, where my LDL went from the 90s to the 300s and then to the 500s when I went keto. and at the time was very lean. And it was very shocking to me, especially with, a family with a medical background going to medical school. I kind of knew what the implications of having an LDL of 400, 500 were. And it's pretty shocking. So it makes you, provoked in studying it. And then you become very engrossed as a scientist when you realize, well, this is a weird pattern. Like, what's up here? And when you have the resources, want to study it. And we're finding these very interesting associations, like the fact that it's true. It turns out that the main driver of high LDL when you're low carb is actually lower BMI, being leaner, not the saturated fat. In fact, we recently had a paper accepted at a major journal that was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. By the time this episode drops, it will probably be out. So it was accepted on January 12th, which is when we're recording. I don't know when the episode will drop, but the paper should be out. And what it shows is that people who are leaner tend to have the increases in LDL. So if you go do the randomized controlled trials in lean people, so normal BMI under 25, there is an increase in LDL. You look at RCTs on people with overweight or obesity class 1, no increase. Obesity class 2, you actually see a decrease. And if you look at the saturated fat data, in comparison, the effect is pretty minimal. So this counters the common knowledge narrative that, oh, people are just seeing increases in LDL because they're guzzling butter. Turns out, probably not the butter, but the six pack, which is actually pretty cool and interesting. So that begs the question, well, what's driving up the LDL then? What's the mechanism here? And of course, what are the implications for risk, which are two separate questions that we're in the process of investigating each of them.
Yeah, very interesting.
So
And so those would presumably go by BMI as opposed to like body fat percentage. Because I'm in the obese category. I have a pretty low body fat percentage, but I respond in the same way. So my LDL
yeah,
shot up as well.
it's just about what data we have access to.
Yeah,
So if we're doing a cohort study on several hundred people, we have BMI data. We don't have DEXs on everybody. So it's
yeah.
a limitation of the literature. We did actually have body comp data on an interventional trial that was run by first author Dr. Isabella Cooper. And what we found was that the fat-free mass and fat mass also were predictive. So if I had to guess, I would guess, yeah, we could get much better predictions with DEXs on everybody. It's just we don't have
Mhm.
that tier of data quite yet.
Yeah,
So we use BMI as a poor man's proxy.
yeah, yeah. It's just a sort of, yeah. It's probably
It's
actually
not
adds
ideal.
leanness to it. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
the leanness. So yeah, I think that it would be ideal not to have to use a BMI cutoff and use a body fat percentage.
Mhm.
I mean, there are a lot of things that go into the lipid energy model, including your, body habitus, probably, your lean mass, your energy expenditure, things like that. So obviously BMI is an oversimplification, but in terms of looking at broad populations, it's what we have at the current moment. But yeah, if you want my speculation, I would say I'd much rather have comprehensive, DEXA imaging on everybody, know your visceral fat, sub-Q, lean muscle mass, and we could probably get more data out of that. But we don't have that on big populations yet, so we're
Yeah,
stuck with what we got.
yeah. Very difficult. So, so if people haven't come across it, can you explain a bit about the lipid energy model?
Yeah. So the 50,000 foot view is when you shift from carb burning to fat burning and you're very lean, you need to upregulate the system that traffics fat fuel around the body. And specifically, what happens is when the liver glycogen stores, the liver carb stores go down, what happens is there are very high levels of free fatty acids circulating around. They go back to the liver, get packaged into triglycerides. Those triglycerides get put aboard these very low density lipoprotein particles. So these big spheres that are packed in with triglycerides. Those get sent out of the liver at a very high rate, we think. But at a commensurate very high rate, there's very quick turnover of these big VLDL particles. The triglycerides get sucked out, put into your muscle tissues to get burned or into your fat cells to replenish the fat cells. And so the triglycerides go down quite a lot because they're getting sucked straight out of the VLDL. And what happens when you take this big VLDL sphere, you suck the triglycerides out, what you end up with is the next step in that lineage, which is the LDL. The VLDL gets turned into the LDL as the triglycerides go down. So those are two parts of the triad. Your LDL goes up with the quick turnover. The LDL has a much longer half-life than the VLDL, and then the triglycerides go down because they're getting sucked out into muscle and fat tissue. The last part of the triad is the HDL cholesterol. And actually, part of the turnover process where that VLDL is being shrunk down into the LDL generates an increase in HDL cholesterol because the surface of the VLDL, right? You take a sphere and you're shrinking it down. You're not just decreasing the volume inside, but the surface area. And there are, when the surface kind of, it's not exactly blebbing, but comes off, it needs to be picked up by an acceptor particle. Cholesterol comes off from the surface and it's picked up by HDL, ApoA particles. And so the HDL cholesterol fraction goes up. And so then you end up with this triad of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides. And it becomes more extreme the leaner you are and the higher your activity level. So in somebody who's, say, very lean and very active and very low carb, you can see levels that are extraordinarily high with LDLs as high as 500, 600. And so that's the basics of the model. And it's useful in that it makes particular predictions that we can test. So adding back carbs should reverse the phenotype. Changing your activity level should reverse the phenotype. So all things being equal, if you can control all other variables, somebody who, increases their cardio, their LDL might go up. This is actually a sub-experiment of one experiment I did, which we're going to talk about, where I saw exactly that. So it's a cool model, and it's very easily predictable, or it makes clear predictions that we can chase up and study. So I do have to give, of course, a hat tip to the father of the model, who was Dave Feldman. He came up with it originally, and we've been developing it for some time. So we published on it in 2022. So I was going to say last year, but I guess it was 2 years ago. And have, set out a set of wish list experiments that we want to do to kind of chase up on the model, see how generalizable this phenotype is. But it's very exciting because it makes such bold predictions that we can test, and I think has a ton to teach us about human physiology and lipid metabolism. So I think, the core of our conversation today is going to be one particularly extreme experiment that I pulled to test the lipid energy model.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So on that note, yeah, what was this experiment that you ran?
Yeah. So for a little bit of context, like I mentioned, the data on this topic has been evolving quite rapidly. We have closing on 10 papers that have been published or accepted. Some pretty robust studies, including meta-analyses of RCTs. So I think that the data is growing, or the data are growing, but it's such a controversial topic. That's a whole nother conversation as to why, which I still can't really wrap my head around about why there's so much pushback and dogma in this space. Nevertheless, there are people that really want to avoid talking about lean mass hyperresponders, suppress the discussion. So I did something that I'm hoping will shove it in everybody's faces and make it impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
So, productive provocation, I'll call it, or legit bait. This is something that it's very intentionally meant to provoke, turn heads, call it clickbait if you want, but it's a legitimate scientific experiment. So, prediction of the lipid energy model. Adding back carbs will lower cholesterol in a lean mass hyperresponder. Question: will any carbs work? Will a pure addition work? And how do any carbs, even bad carbs, compare to, standard of care statin therapy? So I went, as the kids, including myself, say nowadays, full send, and designed a study whereby I compare consuming Oreo cookies to high-intensity statin therapy for LDL lowering. That was the question. And the hypothesis would be that Oreo cookies might perform equal to, or maybe even better than, a statin in a lean mass hyperresponder, because adding back carbs will remove the driving force behind the lipid energy model. So what I did was I designed the study with input from a consultant cardiologist and lipidologist. I went and got the appropriate IRB exemptions from Harvard, which, they granted me the proper exemptions. I got my PCP on board. She was ordering all the tests. They went straight into the electronic medical record. I can't fake this. And had her monitoring along with my consultant lipidologist. So did everything by the books, above board, and announced the protocol a priori. Actually on a prominent vegans podcast, Plant Chompers. The host is Chris McCaskill. He's a really lovely guy. But you can see the episode where I announce it saying, look, I'm doing this. I'm putting the protocol out there. So I'm embarking on this journey. and then we'll see what the data show. The results came in, and I won't bury the lead any further. The Oreo cookies were more than twice as potent as the statin in lowering the LDL. The Oreo cookies actually kicked statin butt at lowering my LDL. So that's your clickbait. That's the headline. The specific numbers were in 16 days, 12 Oreo cookies per day lowered my LDL by 71% from 384 milligrams per deciliter to 111. That was in 16 days, as compared to the statin, which I took for 6 weeks. And the lowest drop in my LDL was only 32.5%, 32.5 for the statin as compared to 71% for the cookies. So the cookies were twice as effective. The absolute drop for the statin was at its nadir 421 to 284 milligrams per deciliter, so 137. So yeah, the cookies were more effective in me, which obviously raises some uncomfortable questions. And that was the intention. And, it's for me, looking at lean mass hyperresponders and lipid energy model, I am just stunned every day by how cool and interesting it is. But I realize that's a difficult thing to translate to shock and awe for your average person. So the goal of this was to do exactly that. Take the shock and awe that I feel for studying this topic and translate it to something that everybody can see and go, wait, what just happened?
Mm-hmm.
And then ask questions about why. Because this is, it's provocative, but it's freaking cool. And if
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't ask you to, and if it doesn't provoke you to ask more questions, you should just hand in your scientist card now, because
Mm-hmm.
this is fascinating. Even if it is, a unique population, lean mass hyperresponders, you have to be provoked into asking, wow, how does this work? And so it's something that is really meant to turn heads, get people looking at the lipid energy model and engaging with the science around this topic. So, you know, I'm definitely throwing a social media and media grenade out there with the potential headlines that might be running. Harvard scientist, medical student lowers his cholesterol with Oreo cookies. Oreo cookies more potent than statin at lowering cholesterol in a medical student.
Mm-hmm.
X, Y, and Z. We'll see if I can control the narrative or if it gets away from me. I'm not even really
Yeah.
sure if that will be the case. This might have been an unwise decision. Nevertheless, here's where we are. I'm expecting a release of the paper in a week or two. And it's going to be a really interesting journey to see how everybody responds. Again, I'm not hiding the fact that this is very intentionally meant to be provocative, but provocative with a productive bend because it's a cool observation. And I want people asking me questions and asking, in the medical community coming together around this and saying, well, what's up? Let's study this further. Let's invest resources into figuring out what's going on with the lipid energy model, lean mass hyperresponders. So that's
Yeah.
where we are. That's what I did.
Yeah, well, that was great. And when I heard about that sort of just snarky, sort of just like, what, I'm going to do this with Oreo cookies, and please try and say that Oreo cookies are good for your heart. I absolutely love that. And I think it's great because if you did with bananas, if you did with bread, there's always going to be some excuse. Well, this could be good for these Oreo cookies. I would love to see anyone argue that Oreo cookies are a benefit to your heart. And so I thought that was
Yeah.
a great choice.
We'll see how it goes down because the criticisms I've already gotten are you're going to mislead people into thinking Oreos are healthy. My immediate response, and I have actually a slide, maybe I'll change it for the Metabolic Health Summit, but I'm like, this is the response, and then I have like a GIF come up, and it's like, really, like
Mhm.
that's your criticism? You
Yeah.
really think people are going to think Oreos are healthy? I hope they're wrong. I
Yeah.
kind of went forward going with this being like, I think I have like I can presume some like basic human you know, common logic and knowledge. I hope I can assume that. I hope people really don't think Oreos are healthy. I put all the caveats in. I mean, it even says in the graphical abstract, this is a metabolic demonstration. I say in the video, do not do this at home.
Mhm.
Like clarify, Oreos are not a health food. So I don't think people will be misled, but that's the point. The point is you have to grapple with the tension and the cognitive dissonance of the fact that this is clearly not a healthy thing to do. And yet we see what is presumed to be a healthy response.
Mhm.
So what do you do with those two pieces of information? How do you resolve that? And I'm not here to resolve that for you. I'm here to put the question in front of you and say, this is what you have to grapple with. Now, let's grapple with it.
Yeah. Well, I certainly don't think your study is going to be misleading to people. However, the Oreo cookie company might be like, "Hey, Oreo cookies drop LDL," and they run that with their headline, "Clinically proven by Oxford Ph.D. to lower your LDL."
We'll see. I mean, well, I'll tell you, I won't be accepting any sponsorship money from Oreo,
No.
but yeah, like I said, I'm playing with fire a little bit. I'm very aware of that. And I'm going to be reflective on how this actually goes down.
Mhm.
Is there a universe in which this really gets out of hand and I have a net negative effect and I regret doing this? Yeah, that could happen. I mean, that's hindsight 2020. I don't know what's going to happen. Like I said, I tried to do this in as a responsible manner as possible. Went to the IRB, got my PCP on board, consultant cardiologist. I've been very above board with my messaging and trying to be clear. If this gets out of hand, I will be the first to apologize. I don't think it will, though. My impression is my best guess is it'll have a net positive impact on just directing attention to this phenotype and engaging people with science. The really cool thing about living in this day and age is the general public has so much access to information through the internet and through social media. And yeah, there are bad aspects to that, but there are also really excellent aspects where you see citizen scientists engaging with the scientific process. And for me, as a scientist and a scientific communicator, there's something really special about being able to translate something that I find really cool into something that other people can find really cool and getting them interested in science. Andrew Huberman always says, "Thank you for your interest in science." And I really love the spirit of that, being able to translate what we as academics love into something that other people can engage with and think about. And I've really found, even through just my new social media and YouTube presence, that people are really smart when you give them a chance and you sit down and explain things to them. And I can't tell you the number of comments on my YouTube videos that are like, "This is so cool. I love learning about this." And it literally can be something like, I go through a mechanism where, oh, intracellular fructose is acted upon by ketohexokinase that depletes ATP, AMP gets acted upon by AMP deaminase 2 to make uric acid, causes translocation of NADPH oxidase 4 to the mitochondria, damages the conjugate citrate, builds up, causes, increase de novo lipogenesis, go through all that mechanism, but in, a step-by-step manner where your average person can actually understand it and go
Mhm.
like, wow, I didn't think about biology like that.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty cool thing to be able to translate. And sometimes I feel like you do need a dramatic metabolic demonstration or a dramatic demonstration of sorts in order to engage people. I mean, the obvious analogy is like a clickbait thumbnail. It's just you have to deal with that currency a little bit in this space, and you can back it with nuance and science.
Mhm.
Walking that line is something I'm still figuring out how to do, but it's a reality that you do have to engage people somehow. So this is one way
Yeah.
to do that, and another benefit to this approach as well. So just
Well, it's
engaging people in science.
Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right, thanks guys. Yeah, well, it also gets rid of a few confounders, right? Because if you picked another carbohydrate source, people would say, well, but that's healthy for these reasons. And there's really no question that Oreo cookies are not good for you. And I hope that they
Yeah.
don't try to run with that narrative that, oh, this proves Oreo cookies are great for you. But I think it's a good demonstration that LDL is not absolute, that if lowering LDL, raising LDL, that's not necessarily a net positive or a negative. And like you said, you're just putting this out there and you're letting other people contend with the meaning of that, and maybe open up, the channel for other studies. One study that came to mind when you said that was a study that they did on the Inuit up in northern Canada in the 1990s. Throughout the 20th century, the Inuit population had extremely low rates of chronic disease, cancer, heart disease, and so on. In fact, next to nothing in the early 20th century. And it slowly started increasing as you go, which, if you would think about it, that's when they're becoming more westernized, more access to Western food. They start smoking. Yeah, I think so. It's statistic once they start smoking as early as 8 years old sometimes. And
Wow.
by the 1990s, they still had extremely low levels of heart disease, even as compared to the rest of Canada. And they said, okay, well, these guys have horrible lifestyle. This is full in full force. Cholesterol theory of heart disease, is in full force in the 90s, and they're just eating blubber and they're smoking as 8-year-olds, right? So they're like, they have super high risk, but they have low rates of heart disease. They probably have genetic protections. They're genetically adapted to living in this environment and being protected against heart disease. That was the theory. So they went and they checked them for a number of different genetic markers that would predispose them or protect them from heart disease. And they found that they had all the bad ones. They had all the things that basically increased their risk of heart disease. So they were not genetically protected against heart disease. And the conclusion was, we have no idea what the hell's going on. We don't know if there's something else going on that's protecting them. They have all these horrible risk factors, or maybe it's just these genetic markers are just not all they're cracked up to be. Maybe they're not as predictive as we thought. So they just sort of went, we have no idea, which really would, I think, beg the question, well, maybe the premise is wrong. Maybe the premise that eating fatty meat causes heart disease is wrong. If you see clear evidence to the contrary, these people are genetically predisposed to getting heart disease, or at least not protected against heart disease. And that's the thing. If you look from an evolutionary standpoint, they aren't the adaptations. They didn't adapt to living in an ice age. We all came from ice ages. Europeans and other populations that have had cultivation for the last 8 to 10,000 years, we're the adaptations. We had to adapt to a new food source and try to make adaptations that would make this less harmful to us. There's clear, distinct drop and decline in our development, brain capacity, height, jaw development, and signs of infectious disease and poor wound healing immediately after agriculture at every point that it was discovered around the world. And we saw this in real time in the last 100 years with the Native Americans and Native Australians. There's a study in 2001 that showed that the Plains Indians in North America, who were just eating bison in the 1800s, during that time, were the tallest population of human beings on Earth. Wipe out the bison, they start eating more Western food. Now they are not the tallest human beings on Earth. And there's that clear, distinct drop. They go from a hunter-gatherer past, really hunter, to a more agrarian diet, and a clear, distinct drop in their height and health. And now they're far less healthy than the average American, eating the same thing, doing the same thing. So I think it really begs a question, is this lipid theory of heart disease even accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and I'm not aware of the studies to which you're referring, so I'm not going to comment on them specifically. But I think the one thing that I heard you say, which I'll build upon, was the whole "we don't know." And I think the most important part of the scientific process is to be humble about the boundaries of the unknown and the limitations of our current model, which is, I think, where something like a lean mass hyperresponder phenotype fits in beautifully. Because there's clearly something here that we don't appreciate the scope of and the implications of. And there are different ways to respond to that. And unfortunately, what I've seen is a little bit of pushback in order to go with the common narrative and the dogma, if you want to use that word, which just doesn't go along with what I feel the spirit of the scientific process is. Um, I can give you one example, which I kind of mentioned when we were offline, that was very shocking to me, which was an abstract published in a top cardiovascular journal, Circulation. You can see it on my Twitter page. I can send you a link to the tweet and the video coverage we did over it. But basically, the title read something to the effect of, a subject stops a statin and a lean mass hyperresponder subject. So they name our phenotype, stops the statin, goes on a ketogenic diet, and develops rapid plaque progression. There was a clear claim in the title that the ketogenic diet caused rapid coronary plaque progression. Now, again, top cardiovascular journal. It was presented at an American Heart Association conference. Now, it was a case report. So when I saw the title, I was just like, okay, They found a patient who had rapid plaque progression on a keto diet. That's not very surprising. We have thousands and thousands of people who are lean mass hyperresponders. Of course, you're going to be able to find one. But then I read the abstract. And when I send you the abstract, I'm sure your jaw will drop to the floor like mine did, because it just was not at all matched to the title. First of all, the patient wasn't a lean mass hyperresponder. They misquote the criteria. And even with the misquoted criteria, he's still not a lean mass hyperresponder. So, they're effectively lying there. And then you read the case history. And the case history went as follows. Patient, sometime in his past, they didn't even say when, but had a percutaneous coronary intervention, so a PCI, because he had a left anterior descending obstruction. So basically, part of his left artery, a major branch of his left coronary artery, was obstructed. This is when he was on a mixed diet, to be clear. He was not keto. But when they went in there to do the intervention, presumably stented open, they noticed, okay, we're fixing this artery, but we can see in the right artery, oh, there's already moderate disease in the right artery. So they note moderate disease in the right artery. Probably patch up the left artery. They stent it open. They put him on a statin. Then some years pass. I'll emphasize, then some years pass, during which time he's not being monitored for plaque progression. And then at some point, he tries a ketogenic diet and has an RCA STEMI. They don't say what the keto diet was. They don't say how long he was on the ketogenic diet. They don't have a baseline for his plaque because years have progressed since they were in his heart for his pre-existing disease while he was on a mixed diet. And nevertheless, they try to pin the blame on the rapid plaque progression on the ketogenic diet. Again, look at that timeline. A guy with heart disease on a mixed diet, presumably on a mixed diet, they didn't say what his diet was, already has disease in his left artery. They look in his left artery or the right artery while they're fixing the left artery. There's disease there. They, let him then progress for years with medication during which there's no further progression. And then he tries a ketogenic diet and has, more right coronary disease. How does that add up to blaming the ketogenic diet for the disease? It literally could have been, oh, he was on statins for a couple of years during which disease was progressing. Then he ate bacon for a week. Yeah, it was the bacon.
Yeah.
And then this gets published in a top cardiovascular journal and presented at an AHA conference. And for the record, in addition to responding to it on social media, I like to go through the proper channels, either contact the authors whose emails were not provided or write a letter to the editor, which we actually tried to do. I had a few cardiologists on board who agreed, look, this is nonsense. And yeah, we'll sign on to a letter. But because it was an abstract and never went to a full manuscript, you can't write a letter to the editor. And generally you have e-letters where you can reply as well. But again, it was an abstract on a full manuscript, so that option wasn't open. So even in emailing the journal, I had a colleague cardiologist email the journal to figure out what are our options for replying in a formal manner. And they basically said, yeah, there's nothing really. We're just going to let it sit there and then move on. So, that's just one example. I found it like, I get people making caricatures out of things on social media. To see that published, I still can't fully wrap my head around that level of bias in literature. And, the peer review process, we all know it's flawed. It's hard to imagine exactly what an ideal peer review process would look like. But something to understand is there are politics involved. It is not a meritocracy. It is not perfect. And I don't want to be too cynical, but there is a degree of gamification and narrative building and double standards, which is something that you have to contend with. I don't know if I'm contending with it in the best manner possible, but you do what you think is right by the science. So, that's also the context in which I'm playing this a provocation game with the experiments I'm doing, trying to, do what I think is right by the science, but at the same time, play with the tools that are available to craft the scientific narrative, because that's all this is. There are data, and we can talk about the data, but people want that translated into a narrative. And so that's always what we're trying to do constantly, turn the data into results and conclusions. And that's a kind of a fun process, but it's a very interesting ecosystem to be in. And yeah, the whole point of this was
Mhm.
why I did the Oreo versus statin study, again, to really force discussion about a topic that is being grossly misrepresented. One example is, an abstract like this, which can get into a top journal and it's complete, like, I'm sorry, it's trash. I know that's strong language, but it was a trash abstract. So you can read it. Everybody can read it. It's open access. I'm pretty sure even without a medical degree, it's a few paragraphs you can read it and be like, really?
Yeah.
This got published? Huh.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Well, I've seen that as well. Obviously in media. Well, there was actually a study out of Columbia that looked it was for media headlines. And so things on the internet, um basically people would read the headline. They did a study that sort of had all these headlines and things like that. And they tracked how many people actually clicked the link and read the article before commenting on it and saying like they knew everything about this. They found that something like 52% of people didn't even click the link before commenting and sharing and saying, oh, look, see, this proves my point, or I think it's wrong because of X, Y, and Z. So it was
yeah.
great. Yeah.
You,
And
it's super amusing. I'm sure you get this too, but like the degree to which people will respond to like a YouTube video or a
mm,
tweet with clearly not reading or understanding anything about the context. I can get two parallel like tweet comments. One calling me like a roided out carnivore MAGA extremist, and the other one's like, who is this like vegan leprechaun statin shill? And I'm like, do you see these like the juxtaposition here about like how I can be caricaturized? And it's just kind of amusing.
yeah.
When it comes to the science, it's this people, if you don't know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, go Google it and read it about Wikipedia. But it's basically the phenomenon that, sometimes people with the least expertise are the most confident in the topic matter. And you see that come out in spades on social media, how confident people are about their understanding of the science and the medicine. And look, I like the idea in general of people, quote, doing their own research and being thoughtful, but don't be hyper arrogant about your understanding of the biosciences because it's freaking complicated. And the more you
Mhm.
engage in it, the more complicated you appreciate it is.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Yeah.
we need a
Well,
dose of humility.
yeah, that's always true. I got a bit the wool taken off my eyes years ago reading different studies and seeing the headlines, seeing their conclusions. Well, this is, and sometimes they'll put the conclusion in the title, which is a bit inappropriate. But their opinion or their editorialization of the data will be in the title, and then that just gets shared around. And then you actually read the study, or you read the abstract, it can be one thing, but then you actually read the study and their actual results and their methods. It really doesn't support the title or the conclusion. And that was pretty awakening for me. And I started getting a bit worried with that. And then obviously there are more extreme examples, like you're saying. I mean, that was just a fraudulent abstract, basically. um,
Yeah.
but if
It,
you don't know better, you'll just see that and just go, oh, look at this.
but it's like, Russian nesting dolls. It can get really nuanced and complex. I don't know if you saw our reanalysis of the 2021 Nature Medicine trial, but there was a 2021 Nature Medicine trial run out of the NIH, published in a top journal, Nature Medicine, that was, the kind of trial that has all the bells and whistles that will make people believe it. It was a randomized, controlled crossover trial in a metabolic ward, comparing low carb to low fat.
Mm.
And the conclusion was that low fat led to less energy intake, and therefore more fat loss. Now, there were a few problems in that, including the fact that there were short-term arms. But nevertheless, again, all the bells and whistles to make people believe it. It gets into a top journal. And it took a couple of years for us to actually look back at it and say, hold on, this study has a huge fundamental flaw. In fact, the results are so misleading that they're basically invalid. And it came really down to one sentence in the whole paper, which was in the methods, where it said, this is subtle, but we looked for diet carryover effects and basically didn't find any. And that's something that most people might overlook. The idea of a diet carryover effect is that one, intervention, one diet, the effect bleeds over into the next one. So if you have diet A and diet B directly follows diet A, then if
Mm.
there's some adaptation happening during diet A, diet A can either pass blame or credit onto diet B. So if you have a crossover trial like this, then and diet effects are bleeding over into each other, it can create very misleading results, which is actually what we found in this paper, that diet order had a larger impact than the diet itself, and that there was a huge advantage of having a low carb diet first. It basically primed your metabolism and primed your, hunger drive to eat less, in line with the carbohydrate insulin model, which we can go into a little bit. But the bottom line was, when you had low carb first, there was positive metabolic priming, so that when you went low fat, you ate fewer calories. Whereas if you had low fat first, then you were negatively metabolically primed to end up eating more. But when you blended everything together, it made low fat look better, when in reality, it was the positive metabolic priming effects of low carb versus the negative metabolic priming effects of low fat. So low fat was passing blame onto low carb, and low fat was stealing credit from low carb. So we break that down in the paper, but that's just another example of how, this can look like a top, high quality study published in a top journal, and it becomes part of the literature and the zeitgeist. And then you look back at it and say, wait, these results are completely misleading, and it have led us down, an incorrect path. So science is a process, and you can make honest mistakes like that. But it's also important to realize that, probably the scientific literature is littered with a lot of things that are leading us in incorrect directions. And so it's always important to just be open-minded and critical of what we think we know, in order to reevaluate it and go in new directions. So yeah, it's a fun process.
Yeah. Well, that was the old saying. I think it was like Benjamin Disraeli said that there's three kinds of lies. There are lies, there are damn lies, and there's statistics, right? And so you can just use these, manipulate the statistics and the data to say anything you want, and it happens all the time. And that's why I try to go to first principles. I try to look at evolutionary biology. I try to look at our evolutionary past to say, okay, does this line up? Do these studies line up with the observed phenomena that we've noticed for millennia, and that we see in the fossil record as well? And if it doesn't line up, I sort of, I think you have to ask why. And you can have a study that says anything, you can conclude anything, and then even in their own methods and results show an actual different story as well. So it's very misleading for scientists, and certainly for people that are just sort of gleaning this information from expert opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
So you said a bit ago that you actually signposted that you were going to do the Oreo study on plant chompers. I didn't actually know you were on plant chompers. What happened there? How did that come about? What did you guys talk about?
Yeah, we connected over, I forget what it was. I had some tweet or video which he commented positively on. I do pride myself on trying to be pretty reasonable and moderate and being able to talk across the aisle. So we really just talked to him about lean mass hyperresponders and why they're unique, and why they needed further study. And to his credit, he was incredibly open-minded and steel-manned our position, and was someone who was willing to give us a platform to speak to, quote, the other side, who likes to make caricatures of us and say that we say things that we don't, we being me and Dave Feldman.
Mm-hmm.
So he was just willing to have a conversation with us and let us, say our piece. And I think was very fair and even-handed about it. My impression is he gained a lot of points, even going after people in their own space. The one portion at the end, you see him go after Thomas Dayspring for spreading misinformation, which was pretty amusing. Dr. Dayspring made some claim about that ketosis decreases LDL receptors, which was not a substantiated claim. It was really interesting in retrospect to see how people, including doctors, responded to that information as if it were just like he was a lipid god and he had just bestowed some wisdom. I was asking in the moment, like, can you share data? Because I'm actually aware of at least mirroring data to the contrary, and one human RCT to the contrary. He never provided any data. Nevertheless, it was to Chris McCaskill, Plant Chompers' credit, he was willing to stand up and say, look, like, Nick's keto, I'm plant-based, which aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but nevertheless, like, here's the phenomenon that they're studying. It's pretty interesting. And here are what the data show so far. And yeah, in that context, I was willing to share that I'd be doing this experiment. I also had, and he's already tweeted about this, so I'm at liberty to share it, a second episode with Chris,
Hmm,
Plant Chompers, yesterday.
nice.
He flew over from California to meet me in Boston
Oh,
to go to the home of Walter Willett and have
oh
a
wow.
conversation.
Interesting.
So that was a lovely conversation, and he'll be dropping it, I think, in two parts. But again, it's interesting to see the responses on social media, like, oh, I can't believe these people are having a polite conversation. People can disagree about certain topics and still engage in a fair and respectful intellectual manner about interesting scientific things. So in that episode, we also talk about the Oreo study. And it is a very interesting thing for me, and it was something uncomfortable, as a student at Harvard Medical School, bringing up with, Professor Willett, who's obviously a big name. So yeah, I'm a student and I'm lowering my cholesterol with Oreos. Let's talk about that. It's uncomfortable, but like you put yourself out there a little bit, and when you caveat it appropriately, and I think I'm pretty forward about your intentions, especially as a student, generally people are pretty interested and respectful, as he was. So yeah, people can look for that episode. Chris has been great. I think, I definitely don't see to him eye to eye on everything. But when you meet people in real life or you give people a chance and you speak to them, not in tweets, you'd be
Mm,
surprised how much common ground you can find and how reasonable people tend to be. So I try to make that effort when people are receptive to it to have a conversation behind the scenes, either on the phone or ideally in person someday, because you can then usually circumvent the problematic incentive structure that arises on social media that leads people to be very punchy and
mhm,
can lead to, let's just say, tension that sometimes I lean into, sometimes I try to diffuse, you know, depending on the day and how I'm feeling. We can definitely go into examples of that. But no, I
mhm,
think I think it's actually pretty easy when people are willing to have a conversation to have a pretty reasonable conversation. The issue, though, is often people aren't like Chris, aren't like plant chompers, and aren't even willing to platform you or have a discussion. So it is very frustrating to me when I see Peter Attia, rolling his eyes, talking about lean mass hyperresponders. I'm like, dude, you're not even trying to have a
yeah.
conversation. He's like, I did a response video. I think it was pretty respectful. You can watch it on my channel, but I'm like, look, here are your points that you make that are pretty decent. But you're saying you're trying to understand this thing. You've looked for explanations. I've given a few that you've not replied to. I know you know who I am. I have an
Mm,
intermediary that can send messages on to him. Bob Kaplan, who is his head of research previously, and who was actually a author on our lipid energy model paper. It's like, look, if you want to be, you know, genuine, let's just have a conversation. Give me the chance to talk to you.
mhm,
And that goes for everybody. I've invited people like Thomas Dayspring on to live conversations to, like, if you think I'm spreading BS, call me out on it. I'm going on Ken Berry in a day or two. He's inviting you on live. This is live in front of, potentially 3 million subscribers. You think you can call me out on BS? Come and do it. Like, I'm
mhm,
happy to have this conversation, but you need to give me the opportunity to have the conversation. And I find that, squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you
mhm,
become someone who people are looking at, there's a little bit of forced platforming. I think that will happen with the Oreo versus statin. I don't think people will be able to avoid wanting to talk about it. That's the goal. That,
mhm,
now you kind of have to, like, there is no more, I can craft a narrative without you. It forces the conversation. That's the goal. And in a space where, in absence of that, otherwise I might not, have the platform. So I'm playing with all this. I'm 28. I don't really know exactly what I'm doing on social media. I'm trying new things, and this is a new thing. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll regret it horribly, but I'm interested to see. I'm interested to see how this all evolves.
Yeah, I regret a lot of things in my 20s. So, you're being, that's not uncommon. But I don't think this would be something you regret. I mean, this is opening the
Yeah.
conversation. This is at least getting people to talk about it, like you say. And you had an opportunity to speak with Chris from Plant Choppers. But I've seen a few of his videos, and I think he's a very reasonable guy. I get the impression that he actually believes this, and he's trying to do the right thing. I obviously disagree with him on at the end result, but I don't disagree with his motivations and how he comes about it. But it is interesting that he was able to bring you on, and that's very interesting. You got to have a conversation with him and Walter Willett. I definitely look forward to seeing that conversation as well, because he's obviously a massive name in nutritional research, and specifically, pushing a plant-based sort of narrative and showing that sort of data.
Yeah. One thing I'll add that I think helps with the conversations that I do have is I really do like to stay in my lane with respect to what I'm talking about in nutrition and specifically within lipids. To clarify that further, I think the topic of what we eat becomes is a topic that it's easy to like have different spheres related to what we eat bleed into each other. So planetary health and animal ethics and nutrition. And these are in culture. And these are all things that are relevant to what we eat and all part of the conversation. But I think we do need to be careful about separating them in order to have focused discussions before we then combine them and consider the factors together. Otherwise, you end up with like a duck, dip and dodge and distract conversation that's just not helpful to anybody. A good example was the recent You Are What You Eat documentary. It was like number one on Netflix for a while, and it was supposed to be it's about the Stanford twin experiment. And I resisted watching it because I knew it would just be a propaganda piece, but I got so many requests to review it. I finally caved in and reviewed it. And the most frustrating thing for me was that it was a bait and switch.
Mm.
It was supposed to be about the Stanford twin experiment, a nutrition study on twins. Every episode opened with like, a lead in where it's like Stanford twin study. It's 4 episodes long. You don't see any data from the study, any data until the fourth episode. The first 3 episodes have no data in them
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever. And in the fourth episode, it's only a tiny portion of the data. The entire rest of it is a propaganda piece talking about other topics, including planetary health, which should be spoken about, but in the appropriate context. Like, I don't want to go see to the movie theaters where they're saying, the movie's going to be Star Wars and they show me The Lion King. Like, tell me what the topic is going to be about and deliver on that. And also don't do things like try to sell me Beyond Burgers. It was
Mm.
actually like there go through these like plant-based alternatives, and some of them just were not even consumed by the participants. Like, here are these Stanford students making plant-based eggs, and you look at the paper and the supplement, it's like, did the participants eat any plant-based eggs? Any at all? No, zero. So like,
Mm.
why are you telling me about this? And a documentary that's supposed to be about the Stanford twin study about making plant-based eggs, which the participants ate none of. Like, so it's a difficult conversation to have when people are always trying to pull something else into the conversation. Look, I get the emotional, um, you know, argument of seeing like, a chicken that looks very unhealthy and is falling in mud. And that's sad. And I don't want animals to be mistreated. At the same time, it's not exactly relevant to the health conversation. It's a related conversation, and we can talk about, appropriate animal agriculture, but don't try to somehow like persuade me that chicken is bad for my health because this chicken looks sad. Those are two separate
Yeah.
things, and it's really easy to let them bleed into each other. And when we can step back and say, look, let's have a conversation about this thing right now, and then we'll have a conversation about this thing and this thing, and then we can talk about them in the context. Then I find the conversations become a lot easier and people become less defensive because I'm not trying to sell anybody on a particular way of eating that is best for all the factors. I don't think that there is a best diet across all realms. I think we're adults. These are complex and difficult discussions to have. So we can talk about the pros and cons of each of them and how they relate to health. Is there a place for a carnivore diet and treating certain diseases? I probably think yes. Can 8 billion people eat a fully carnivore diet? I definitely think no. those things can coexist and we can have the conversation separately. And when we realize that, I think having focused, reasonable discussions, among people with different overall perspectives is actually very easy.
Yeah, definitely. It was it's interesting that you sort of mentioned Peter Attia as well. I just saw a clip. I didn't watch the whole episode because I didn't care to, but he was on with Derek from More Plates, More Dates, and they talked about, how are these people saying, sort of mentioning the lean. I don't think that one they mentioned lean mass hyperresponders specifically, but basically saying if you are metabolically healthy, that LDL doesn't necessarily matter as much. There's a paper from Dr. Paul Mason, David Diamond, and Ben Bickman that made that claim. Said, look, here's the literature on this, and if you have high LDL and you have low triglycerides, and you're on a ketogenic diet, that your LDL isn't actually of a concern. And so there is data out there, and papers out there making that claim. And what he said was, I don't understand this. I don't understand these people. If anybody understands, science and mathematics and statistics, they'd know that LDL is causative, is 100% proof that LDL is causative, neglecting the fact that there are no studies showing causation between LDL and cardiovascular disease, and the only ones that have ever been done, like randomized, you can't show causation with associated studies, and the only RCTs that were done that I know of, that they gave polyunsaturated fats to replace saturated fats with to lower LDL cholesterol, either found no connection, no association between the LDL levels and the cardiovascular disease, and in one they actually found that lowering LDL cholesterol with polyunsaturated fats actually caused more heart attacks, strokes, and death from cardiovascular disease as well. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
So my response video to Peter Attia was on that interview with Derek.
Right.
So people can watch that, because I respond to those points directly. I'll say two things. One, is on the point of LDL and causation. I've found that the word causation causes a lot of confusion, because I think that it's technically accurate when used as it's part of the causal pathway. It is part of the causal pathway. It's necessary to cause. It doesn't, though, follow that it's sufficient to drive. So I think the more straightforward way to break it down is it's necessary but not sufficient. And in the interview with Derek, Peter says this directly. It's necessary but not sufficient. So what do you do with that information? Well, one could argue, and it's a legitimate argument, if you have a disease model and you have a necessary factor, you target the necessary factor, because if you sweep the legs out from under that, the disease goes away, or you can't have the disease. But if it's not sufficient, then it doesn't make sense to treat it in every case. And the answer is, not necessarily. The issue I have with that interview, and I alluded to this before, is when Peter says that he's tried to understand the perspective of those. And they didn't name lean mass hyperresponders, but they talked about the high LDL, the low triglycerides. And I know Peter's aware of lean mass hyperresponders, if for no other reason than I've sent him emails saying, do you want to be on our LMHR editorial in JCL? To which he said respectfully, no, please refer to Ronald Krauss, who is the expert. And I got Ronald Krauss, and he's now the senior author on that editorial. Side note. That aside.
Yeah.
The arguments he makes are, I think, not correctly framed. They're arguing high HDL and low triglycerides are so protective. I'm not arguing they're protective. I'm arguing they're part of a triad that is unique with unique etiology. And then he goes in that conversation directly in to the FH analogy. He's like, he said that bit about people who understand math and statistics, and he said something to the effect of like, I can't understand why people don't get, and then he talks about familial hypercholesterolemia and how, it's actually he blends in things that I think will be very confusing to people. Like, it's a phenotypic diagnosis for a genotypic condition. And this, that, and the other, it's actually a phenotype, blah, blah, blah. That aside, what I've tried to emphasize repeatedly in my own conversations as a basis for what we're starting to talk about is just that misrepresentation, the one that Peter leans directly into in that conversation. He talks about FH and why it proves his point. And what I'm saying is, Peter, you need to distinguish what we're talking about, a metabolic response,
Mm-hmm.
to a genetic condition where you have a broken lipid metabolism. Yeah, because it's, polygenetic, you can have multiple genes. It's still a genotypic condition that's congenital. You have it from birth. You have a broken lipid metabolism. It's not necessarily responsive to carbohydrate restriction, not necessarily associated with a particular triglyceride to HDL ratio. Now, contrast that to a population of people who have normal LDL that skyrockets in response to carbohydrate restriction. It's a reversible phenotype generally associated with people who are lean. There's an inverse association with BMI and triglyceride to HDL ratio, and no broken lipid metabolism. Those are clearly distinct etiologies. And so if you're not separating them from the get-go, then you can't really have an evolved conversation about it, which he and Derek don't, because he never makes that separation. He goes straight into the FH analogy, which I think, is a failed premise. So, he makes some good points in that conversation, which I give him credit for in my response video. But if you want to be sincere about actually trying to understand this phenotype and having this conversation, then you actually need to have a conversation with us. And people have asked. Simon Hill, who's the proof, tweeted that he wanted me and Peter to have a discussion on his channel. I'm not sure if, Peter was made aware of that and declined, because that offer seemed to then later move off the table. But you know, I'd be surprised if Peter wasn't aware I was talking about this and, wasn't that I wasn't on his radar. I would think that if he sincerely wanted to understand this topic, he would engage with it. My
Mm-hmm.
impression is he hates talking about nutrition. Actually, in his book, I didn't read it, but Chris McCaskill did a review of it and was sharing from some quotes from it. And there was this one part where clearly he was joking, but the, joking, not joking had a tone, said something to the effect of that he would prefer to fake a grand mal seizure than talk about nutrition. Again, a joke, but like to the point that he doesn't like talking about nutrition because he finds it dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do feel like you're expressing a little bit of your own dogma if you're unwilling to have a conversation with the people who are actually leading this research. So that is me, providing an open invitation to have that conversation in a non-defensive manner. Again, I think some of the things we're doing now are going to force that conversation. I wouldn't be surprised if in 2024, me and Peter do have a conversation about lean mass hyperresponders. And if it took me pulling an Oreo versus statin stunt to make that happen, then so be it. So we'll see if my strategy works.
Yeah.
I'm being a little bit of a provocateur, and that is completely the intent. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think he's a smart guy.
Oh,
I think we
definitely.
could have a good conversation,
Yeah.
and I just want the opportunity for that to happen because honestly, I think his viewer base would get a lot from it, including finding out that me and Dave Feldman and our colleagues are not keto zealot extremists. We're just scientists asking questions.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Yeah. I mean, you can be very intelligent and still disagree with people who are also very intelligent. I mean, it is, I think the definition of being open-minded to understand that two people can look at the same situation and intelligently and honestly come to different conclusions. I mean, that's just human nature. We're going to have a lot of different influences. We have a lot of different experiences and knowledge that are going to shift our thinking on something. And so that's very normal. And debates used to happen all the time. Used to have public debates all the time. Famously, they would have Nobel Prize winner economics Friedrich Hayek would debate Lord Maynard Keynes in England on different sort of deficit spending, socialist sort of economics versus free market economics. And Hayek and Keynes debated, fiercely all the time, but they were great friends off the stage. They weren't attacking each other and being nasty. They were just debating the facts, and they're actually very, very close friends outside of that. And that's something that should happen. You should be able to disagree with people and still be friends with them and still be collegial with them. We've lost that. I think now it's just if you disagree with someone, it's because you hate them, or if you disagree with them, you have to hate them, or something silly like that. Or if you don't
Yeah.
like them, you have to disagree with them. And none of these things are the case. And so, Dr. T is a very intelligent man, and that doesn't mean that you have to agree with him on everything. I don't think I've agreed with anybody on everything except people that have just said, hey, well, here's the evidence, here's the boost. Okay, well, you've clearly proved that. If you find yourself agreeing with everybody around you, you're most likely in a cult, because that's the only time that really happens, where you all think the exact same thing and there's no deviation, and no deviation will be accepted. To the FH discussion, like you said, those are two very different populations. You're talking about familial hypercholesterolemia. Like you said, this is, they're going to have high LDL cholesterol. They're going to have these problems regardless of their lipid metabolism. If they eat a sleeve of Oreo cookies every day for 2 weeks, probably not going to change their cholesterol level. So that's a different population. But it's also, is my understanding, from a presentation I saw from Dr. David Diamond, that actually you have to differentiate out the FH population as well, because they have a propensity to have clotting disorders as well. And when you separate out those who have a clotting disorders from the ones who only have the high LDL cholesterol, it's only the ones with clotting disorder that seem to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, and stroke in the early decades. And then after about 50, it sort of evens out. That's my understanding. And as far as Dr. Attia saying that, this is higher LDL is required, but not necessarily the driver of this, or not sufficient. I've seen a number of studies, or at least recommendations, that you just need to keep lowering LDL cholesterol. If you keep having heart attacks, just keep lowering your LDL. There's no bottom floor on how low you can get your LDL if you're still having heart attacks. And that suggests to me, and there's other data that shows that 50% of Americans who have heart attacks, I think they looked at something like 160,000 people, half of them had low LDL cholesterol. So maybe there's a threshold, but I don't know, because a lot of people have very low LDL cholesterol and they say, well, let's lower it more. And they're still having heart attacks. So it's like, okay, well, maybe we're barking up the wrong tree. And so, and then when you couple that with a lot of the historical records that are coming out recently, like in the JAMA article in 2016 from the Sugar Research Foundation in the 60s, detailing how they were paying off professors from Harvard and elsewhere to basically cast the blame on cholesterol, to because there were studies coming out showing a very strong association between sugar consumption and heart disease. And they're like, okay, well, let's get another narrative out there. A lot of these things, and one of those professors was named head of the USDA, and he was the one who authored and published studies from the USDA saying that cholesterol causes heart disease. So when you sort of untangle that, and you sort of look at the basis of LDL being a problem in the first place, I do sort of question whether you actually have to have high LDL in order to get heart disease as well, or if it's just something unrelated entirely.
I mean, based on the fact that patients with lower LDL can get heart disease, I think it's pretty clear you don't need very high LDL.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there are patients with high LDL who don't get heart disease. So obviously,
Yeah.
it's not the whole picture. There does seem to be somewhat of a myopic clinical view on it as a marker, just because it's very clear how to address it. It's an easy W, you
Mm.
could say. If a patient comes to your clinic
Yeah.
and they have high LDL, you know what to do, and you can just get the points down. Like, it's not a hard thing. And the other things like atherogenic dyslipidemia, there aren't good drugs to treat it. And because, the markers aren't causative, it's not really clear what, the effects are. And you need a lifestyle intervention to really change the markers in a productive way. And that is not how our, medical system is built. It's not built per se lifestyle first. It should be.
Mm.
Professor Peter Libby at Harvard had a beautiful review. I think it was in Nature in 2021. It was something like the changing landscape of atherosclerosis, where he makes the point. We've been lowering LDL more and more, and we have more advances in pharmacotherapy to lower LDL, and yet heart disease rates aren't really going down. Maybe that's because the profile is changing. More people have atherogenic dyslipidemia, metabolic syndrome, obesity, and statins aren't going to treat that. It
Mm.
doesn't mean they don't have their place, but it means we do need to take a broader view and say, look, what is the risk profile of patients now, and how do we address it? And the quote, unfortunate, a little bit of sarcasm there, answer
Mm.
is that, the answer might not be a pill.
Yeah.
It might just be eating a species appropriate diet and living a healthy lifestyle. Maybe we can start there, but nobody likes to do that. So here we are.
Yeah. Well, you want quick fixes, and people do want quick fixes, but I think doctors want quick fixes more than anything. With you know, nutrition was used in a lot, and I mean, goodness, how long? Well, attributed to Hippocrates, but who knows? As let food be thy medicine, and medicine thy food. And also another quote attributed to Hippocrates was, before you cure someone of their disease, ask them first if they're willing to give up what is making them sick. And these are eminently applicable now. And for 100 years we have data on and studies on ketogenic diets helping epilepsy, in particular childhood epilepsy, for instance, and migraines, and diabetes. And yet there was a change. I was speaking to Professor Thomas Seyfried of Boston College. He does cancer research. He's an eminent cancer biologist. When he was doing his postdoc at Yale, he was doing research into ketogenic diets and epilepsy. He was following this along, and someone in his department, maybe the head of the department there in neurology, was just told him, it's like, hey, don't worry about it. This is sort of a dead end research. We have these drugs now, they work just as well, and it's hard to counsel people into changing their diet. It's hard to get them to stop eating carbohydrates. It's easier just to give them a pill. And so I think it's probably more in from our laziness as clinicians, that it's just like, well, this is easier to give a pill. It works just as well. It's hard to sort of have because look, this is my practice. I'm a neurosurgical resident, but like I have a practice outside of that, preventative medicine and functional medicine, that I do on the side. And like, I have to have hour-long conversations with people to talk to them and counsel them about diet and lifestyle and go through all these things with them. It takes a long time. And if you are rushed, as everyone is in medicine, you're only supposed to have 10, 15 minutes per patient. You've got 30 patients to see. It's very difficult to do that. And so I think that some of that's come down on us, that we've gotten a bit lazy and saying, well, let's just give a pill. But I think we have to get back to our roots and address lifestyle before we start adding pills. And pills are great. I think there's definitely a place for modern medicine and pharmacology, but I think that you address the diet and lifestyle first, and put an epileptic kid on a ketogenic diet. If they can't do it or it's not sufficient, then you look to pharmacology.
It's complicated because you use the term lazy, and I think probably we both agree this is not like the clinicians I see working, 18, 20-hour days,
Yeah,
100-hour
not
weeks. Lazy is the farthest word from.
true.
It's the whole infrastructure around people, and it becomes impossible to operate in the way we actually want to and do the best by patients because of the pressures that are passed down.
Mm-hmm.
Clinicians often have, I think it seems to me, at least from where I'm standing, very, very little autonomy in terms of, the amount of time they have with their patients, and even, patient nutrition. I walk through the hospital. Sometimes I see plates. They actually have on the receipts the carb counts. I'll see things with over 250 grams of carbs. They're like multiple maple syrups, pancakes, juice, Fruit Loops. The physician didn't order that.
Yeah.
They didn't decide what was on the menu. The patient did. Like the hospital infrastructure set up the circumstance so that could occur. That said, it is an ecosystem where the physicians are the face, and the whole hospital experience, they're kind of seen as the buck stops with us. And so I do think while it's not clinician laziness or a clinician's fault, there are a lot of topics about which we're passionate advocates, and there need to be more of us talking about the fact that no, it's not appropriate to have pastry shops at every hospital entrance and be bribing people to get vaccines with Krispy Kremes.
Mm.
Even though it's Krispy Kreme that's doing the promotion, we should say, look, this is not appropriate. We're not going to allow this. This is screwed up. So that is within our power as a broader community to do. And I think we just need to open our eyes a little bit and, address the problem that's right in front of us. And it's not a problem that's even that controversial. If I go to my residents or attendings and be like, can we just observe for the second that this patient has an HbA1c of 13 and they're
Mm.
eating chocolate cake? And we were like, yeah, that's probably a problem. That is a problem, but it's not what I like. It's not my responsibility to deal with it right this moment. I didn't make this decision. The patient has to eat. This is this. I can't solve this right now with everything else I'm juggling in the world. So it's something that in the aggregate we need to address. But I definitely wouldn't place blame on any individual for the fact that the patient decided to order a chocolate cake and the system is permitting it. Do I think it's a good idea? Definitely not.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. It is strange. I mean, same thing. It's all over the world. As an, I've been in hospitals on 4 different continents now. Every single one is the same. It's just sugary carbs, sugary carbs, sugary carbs. That's just what patients get. And it's that I think that in itself is a problem. But it's low fat. That's the key. And
I
so
will see. Yeah, low sodium, low cholesterol, low fat,
yeah,
orange
high
juice.
sugar. Yeah, exactly. High sugar, high carb. And
That's
yeah, frosted flakes and things like that, and so it's a bit strange. I think that's a fundamental problem as well. I do think that, of course, the people aren't working 18 hours, aren't lazy. It's not that they can get overwhelmed by things, but I think that's something too. I mean, i I look at these sorts of things and I have a problem with it, and I don't have time on rounds or anything like that to do it. I will come back and I'll talk to those patients sometimes and just say, hey, you know, you know, maybe this is a better way of doing it. And I come back on my own time. It's difficult to do. And when I'm counseling patients in the clinic, it takes a long time. But I feel that it would be unethical to not talk to them about it. Especially something that I think that would help them in a number of different ways, which is why I like the preventative medicine practice as well, because you do get to have longer conversations with people, and you can sort of
Mhm.
flesh these things out as well. And that's honestly why I started a YouTube channel, is this. I could say, look, I don't have time to talk about all this stuff. Here's some videos you can watch, and that my
Yeah,
God has helped a lot with time saving. But
yeah. It's
it's
gratifying to be able to scale.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Dr. Gary Fettke, really nice guy. He's an orthopedic surgeon here in Australia, and he was famously attacked by the Dietetics Association in Australia. The head of the ADA, the Australian Dietetics Association, personally called the CEO of his hospital, telling him that you need to shut this guy up, you need to shut him down, because he was prescribing ketogenic diets to his patients to try and avoid getting his diabetic patients to try to avoid leg amputations, and it was working. And they were telling him that you have to stop this. And it's just like he's actually helping people. He's objectively helping people. Interestingly enough, organization here called Low Carb Down Under, which is a group of doctors that put medical conferences together for low carb sort of research. They actually sued for the minutes of board meetings of I don't know which cereal company, but maybe presumably one of the ones here in Australia, but I don't know. And they found that in this board meeting, they said, hey, this whole ketogenic diet movement is really screwing up our cereal sales, and we need to target certain voices in the ketogenic community, and we need to shut them up. And they named Dr. Fettke by name in that. Like, we need to shut this guy down. And they're the major funders of the dietetics associations in America, in the UK, in Australia. And so they pulled their strings at the ADA, and the head of the ADA calls Gary Fettke's hospital and says, you need to shut this guy up. You need to shut him down. And they went after his medical license, and he had to fight that for years and go through the courts and everything like that. And it was absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, there's some crazy stuff going on. But one of the things that Dr. Fettke said was that, once you see this, once you see how powerful these nutritional dietary lifestyle changes can be in people's lives, you can't unsee it, and you can't not use it as a clinician. And that's what he started using with his diabetic patients that were needing amputations. And all of a sudden they didn't need the amputations, or they didn't need as extensive of an amputation. And then his joint replacement patients too, they'd come in and say, hey, I've got this bung shoulder, this bum knee. And they're like, yep, you qualify for a joint replacement, book you in for 3 months. but until then, you need to be on this diet. And they're like, okay, all right, whatever I need to do to make sure this goes well. And he says that more often than not, he would get a call at about 2 months from these people to say, you know what, I don't think I need surgery anymore. My shoulder feels fine. My knee feels fine. Says, great, no problem. Just let me know if you need anything else, if something changes, So I think there's ways you can do it. And when you see how powerful it is as a clinician, and you see what a massive difference this makes in people's lives. I mean, you've seen it in your own life, so so you're already there, but if you see how much it can change people's lives, I don't see how you can do really anything else, because it makes such a big difference in people's lives. And when you see that, and the amount of comments that I get on my videos, or I get, personal messages, or just my patients that I see, the radical changes that I see in their health, it's just, and I get a lot of heat from a lot of people, Simon Hill included, who just say that I'm doing horrible things to people. And yet it's like it's like a fly on the wall. I mean, it's just like, it's nothing compared to the inundation of people that are telling me this has radically changed their lives. And so, I don't think I can go back to just sort of doing things in a traditional way and ignoring that. I think I have to do both. Even in neurosurgery, I'm going to be counseling my patients to eat a certain way and to benefit their life, and hopefully avoid surgery, because even though I really enjoy doing surgery, I don't want to have to do it on someone who could avoid. Hey everyone, if you need a little extra help getting started on a carnivore diet and my online resources that I have for free aren't enough for you, you can go to www.howtocarnivore.com and sign up for a 30-day carnivore challenge, where you'll have online resources, group support, weekly Zoom meetings, as well as the ability to chat live with myself, Simon Lewis, and the others in the challenge who can help you and support you and give you extra advice and help you along the way. So if that sounds like something that would be beneficial to you, then please go to howtocarnivore.com and sign up. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you there.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree entirely.
Yeah. So that's my little speech at the end anyway. So so what about yourself? So you've been keto for a long time. What do you eat at the moment? And do you think that you see that changing, or are you happy with where you're at?
Yeah, when I started a keto diet, just because of taste preferences and what I thought was healthy at the time, it was very Mediterranean-esque, lots of like avocado, salmon. I've just toyed with a lot of forms of keto. All of them are sufficient for me to don't have, not have IBD flares. I will say my stomach operates better when my fiber intake is lower.
Hmm.
So I'll eat a lot of eggs and salmon, some red meat. Nothing against it. I just love fatty fish, and
Hmm.
I really love cheese. So will eat a lot of cheese. If I had to guess, probably most of my calories come from olive oil, salmon, and eggs. I love me some good organ meats and a good steak as well. When I'm on clinicals, I do tend to eat carnivore plus olive oil, I'll say, kind of on that spectrum. It just allows me to operate a little bit better. I love low carb vegetables, like a bowl of, roasted Brussels with walnuts. It will just take a little bit of a toll on the GI system in the morning.
Literally sounds
So
like
I ebb
morning.
and flow. I ebb and
What?
flow. I like the taste of it. I mean, like quite honestly, if I didn't need low carb therapeutically, like there are things that I like,
Yeah.
I'd love make a, sweet potato with some goat cheese and figs. I've never used low carb for like weight loss, so that's not an issue for me. Um, every now and then I'll flex out, have like a little, like the other night I made my partner like a honey roasted carrot dish with like tahini garlic dressing, and had some of that. So I'm not super strict about it, but I do remain in ketosis
Mhm.
with a primarily animal based basis. And yeah, it's worked well for me. I could not eat bread for the next 100 years and be perfectly happy. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's really surprising how you recalibrate and how much you can enjoy simple eating when, if you had asked me when I was a teenager, Nick, do you imagine not eating like sugar and pie and ice cream? I would have been like, you're crazy. Like
Mm-hmm.
I could not go a week without eating ice cream. And now I'm like, I don't care. I don't need it. There's no drive. You're liberated of a drive that you think is intrinsic to you to have this crap food.
Mm-hmm.
And then you learn you can actually enjoy just as much something that's really simple. I don't have a sweet craving often, but like if I do, some like red pitted frozen cherries right out of the freezer, like two or three, tastes great.
Mm-hmm.
I'm totally satisfied. So yeah, I am really enjoying the lifestyle. And I find the hardest part is the social aspect, but I also find that if you stick with it, people tend to gravitate towards what you eat
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing really well and they see you doing well. And this is especially true with weight loss. Like I know, I don't know if you follow everybody, by the way, if you're not following him, need to follow Dave Dana. He goes by Dave E. Dana. And if you've been following his story, he started
Oh,
on
that's
Twitter a couple of years ago. He was over 400 pounds
mm-hmm.
and he went low carb and has been losing weight just consistently. He's now lost 138 pounds, but like along that journey, he's mental health's improved, financial well-being. He completed his MBA. He got married. He's the guy that's been getting props constantly from Arnold Schwarzenegger. So like when he got married, Arnold
Yeah.
put like a 12-second clip saying like props on how well you're doing. It's really
Yeah.
blown up and is just a
Nice.
positive source of a constant source of positive energy. But one of these people who look, it takes some activation energy to change your life. It's going to be a little bit socially uncomfortable for a period of time. But then there's a flip in the switch where people aren't saying, oh, you're weird for not having the office cake. They're like, wow, what you're doing is really cool. I want to join.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a positive social force rather than a negative one, I find.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I've noticed that as well. That when you're quietly confident about what you're doing and you're doing it for very clear reasons, and you have justification for those decisions, and people see the results, the clear results in you, that they start become interested as well. You know, I mean, my entire department has at least flirted with carnivore, and has at least dramatically increase the amount of meat that they eat. Many have done keto, couldn't quite go full carnivore, but many tried carnivore, and then some of them stuck with it, and others for sort of logistical family reasons. Other people weren't really doing it with them, and they're like, oh well, I guess I'll go away. But they all said like they felt amazing doing it, and then just because they just wanted to eat what everyone else was eating, which is it's understandable. They sort of went back to more, but eating a lot more meat. And yeah, I've noticed that as well, that more and more people around the hospital started eating a lot more meat. And then I'd be in like the emergency room, like seeing patients and things like that, like writing my notes. And then like one of the ED consultants will just sit down and just start like talking to me about it. And I'm like, I've never talked to this guy about it in my entire life, but he starts to, okay, so when you eat, what do you do when you do this? I'm like, okay. Because it's just more and more people are getting interested in it. And I agree, that when you have that positive influence, other people see that. And it can be very self-conscious for people at first. But once you get, accustomed to it, acclimatized to it, it actually isn't a source of embarrassment. Most of the time people are interested in it as well. And
Yeah.
the less you sort of talk about it, the less it sort of, goes, by the way, that people just don't even, it's just normal. If you're not drawing attention to it, there's nothing to draw attention to.
Yeah. Agreed.
Very good. All right. Well, Nick, thank you so much. That's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I absolutely loved it. I'm really glad we were able to connect. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really glad we are able to do this. Also want to say, please let us know where we can find you, where we can follow you, and also when the Oreo study. I mean, we're probably going to publish this after the Oreo study comes out, and we'll try to put
Yeah.
a link in the description where people probably hopefully share this around on their social media and try to really publicize this and get this spoken
Yeah.
about. But where can they find you? Where can they support your work?
Yeah. So I'm at Nick Norwitz, NickNorwitz on Twitter. I'm pretty active there. And then, yeah, the call to action from me would be just what you said. This video will go out presumably when the Oreo study drops, which I think from this recording will be probably next week. It'll be before the Metabolic Health Summit in Florida at the end of the month.
Mm.
So, what we really want people to do is take the link from the paper and put it in an original tweet or a quote retweet, including that link. It helps boost scoring metrics on attention. And that's really important for pushing this conversation forward. And in addition to that, if you'd please take the 8 minutes to watch the video abstract covering the paper. My friend and colleague Dave Feldman did the animations. It's absolutely beautiful. I think you'll really enjoy it. So that's 8 minutes, and I'm hoping for that to go viral. Even the leak video did pretty well, so we'll see how well the video abstract does. But I'm hoping for 6 figures, maybe 7 views on that. So if you could be one of those and share that around, that will be wonderful as well. It'll all help push the conversation forward. And yeah, I mean, for those listening up until this point in the conversation, thank you very much. And I really hope you do, get provoked by this little stunt I'm pulling and want to engage further with the other robust research we have going on.
Yeah, and I think that ties into the lean mass hyperresponder data that came out as well, which showed that, after what was it, like a year or more on just a high fat keto diet with very high LDL cholesterol, did not show any progression in atherosclerosis. Is that correct?
That was, yeah, 4.7 years. So there's a study going
4.7
on
years.
out of the Lung Institute, and the baseline data came out from that, in which they matched a population of 80 people on the lean mass hyperresponder spectrum with a mean LDL of 272 to a similarly healthy population, the Miami Heart cohort, with an LDL average of 123. If you want to do out the math there, if average time on keto was 4.7 years, multiplied by the delta in the LDL, which I think was 149, you end up with something like a 700 milligram per deciliter a year difference, which is pretty high in terms of exposure to LDL. And what was found was that the keto group did not have increased plaque. In fact, if you were looking at the trends, they were trending to lower plaque, and there was no association between LDL and total plaque score. Now, these are preliminary data. Nevertheless, they're an evolving part of the story with respect to lean mass hyperresponders. And by the time this video comes out, we should also have a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So you'll see me tweeting about that. There is a robust body of literature evolving, and this whole little statin versus Oreo PR stunt is to get you to turn your heads and look at that body of literature. So
Yeah,
hopefully you will be provoked and engage with the broader body and the evolving story.
absolutely. Well, I'll try to put all the links for those pieces of
Share them.
literature in the description so people can take a look at that, and I encourage them to, and hopefully they can read them and share them around and get more attention to them. Nick, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.